No problem, Margaret. Okay, so we are actually live now on YouTube, and I guess we'll start. It's unusual for us to start on time, but we might as well. So I'm delighted to have everyone back. Thank you guys for joining us on this Martin Luther King Day. It's, of course, a federal holiday here in the States, so people may be away or just coming back from a long weekend. But I'm delighted to have this author and activist with us. He's the author of a book called Black and Green: The Fight for Civil Rights in Northern Ireland and Black America. And we've talked a little bit about this before, that Black activists in America and activists at home in Ireland had a relationship that spanned several centuries. Particularly famous example, of course, is when Frederick Douglass visited Ireland and was called the Black O'Connell, in honor kind of Daniel O'Connell, the Kerryman. So Brian focuses on the connections that were made in the 1960s when civil rights protesters in Northern Ireland drew inspiration for their struggle from the civil rights campaigns in the American South. And he examines how Irish protesters actually had links with radicals like the Black Panther Party, but also how the tactics of the non-violent marches and sit-ins were adopted. And it's really a fascinating study which demonstrates how protesters in Northern Ireland acknowledged the extent to which their battles against discrimination were influenced by the American struggle for civil rights here in this country. Brian also is senior advisor at the NGO Human Rights First, and he is part of an international panel of experts which are investigating actually the state impunity during the conflict in Northern Ireland. So he's going to talk to us a little bit about that work at the end of his presentation on his book. So welcome, Brian. Happy New Year to you, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to highlight you and now unmute myself. Everyone that is on live here, you can just type the questions in the Q&A here, and the same thing on YouTube. If you have questions, we'll be delighted to take them at the end. So I'll mute myself, but I am here, Brian, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for asking me to do this. It's great to be able to do this on Martin Luther King Day. The book that I'm mostly going to talk about, I wrote, well, it was published 25 years ago, and it took me a good few years to write it. And so a lot's happened actually since I wrote the book, and it was published in 1998. And I'll come on to that towards the end of my talk here, because there are some things which I didn't know about when I wrote the book. Some new archives have been opened since it was published. And then, of course, other things have happened in the last 25 years, which are also new layers on this relationship between the activists in Ireland and the US. I've seen a couple of places where this talk is billed as, and I think for my own organization too, billed as the influence of Martin Luther King and the US experience on activists in Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, in the 1960s. And that's true, and I'm going to address that, but it's really only half the story. To overgeneralize, really, much of that influence of that relationship, that two-way traffic across the Atlantic, where one set of activists influenced the other, really from the 1840s up to about the 1920s, most of that influence went from east to west. Really, it went from Ireland to the struggle for abolition, and then the early decades of the 1900s, the influence of the Irish experience on Black nationalism in the US. So you have Frederick Douglass going to Ireland. I mean, that isn't exactly where it started, but it's a good point to start telling the story. Frederick Douglass goes to Ireland. He says he was inspired to escape slavery in Baltimore by two Irish sailors who he met randomly on the docks. But anyway, he escapes to the north and of the US, and then tours Ireland in 1845, and he's a bit of a sensation there. Very eloquent speaker, goes all over the country, meets and becomes very close personal and political friends with Daniel O'Connell, who is at the time trying to, and successfully is leading, a movement for a sort of a Catholic emancipation and Catholic rights to vote. And they strike up a very strong political and personal relationship. And Elizabeth said Douglas was called, rather patronizingly, I guess, like the Black O'Connell. You never really hear O'Connell being called the White Douglas, but nonetheless, they had a real friendship, a real personal political affiliation. But then as the generations go on, the links between the two struggles develop and enhance. In the early 1900s, the Irish national movement, the nationalist movement around the budding Sinn Féin organization was very influential on some of the Caribbean nationalists who found themselves in London around that time. And so you see from some of the Caribbean activists who later then go up to New York and become very influential in the US movement. Briggs, Marcus Garvey, S.A.G. Cox, some of those others, they imitate what they have seen from the Irish national movement in the early 1900s and the 1920s. So, for instance, Marcus Garvey was part of something called the National Club of Jamaica, and it, as activists do, borrowed and stole terminology, slogans, iconography. We all do it all of the time. And the newspaper for the National Club of Jamaica was a translation of Sinn Féin. The newspaper was called Our Own. Now, Marcus Garvey then moves to New York. He becomes really the grandfather of Black nationalism in the US. It sets up the White Star Line, sets up this United Negro Improvement Association, a huge mass movement of Black people. And when he's asked about the influences, he very often cites the Irish struggle. For instance, the black and red and green flag that he has as the emblem of the UNRA. When he explains why it's those colors, it's black for the people, it's red for the Reds, for the socialists, for the communists of the world that he has an affinity with, and green for Irish people. The Irish struggle from the late, I guess, 1800s up to certainly the early decades of the 1900s is both a political and a cultural movement. You see, for instance, the codification of Irish sports rules, regulations around the GAA, huge boom in the Irish language movement. And by the 19-teens and the 1920s, also you see a cultural explosion really in the East Coast of the US, centered around the Harlem Renaissance, very influenced by what had been happening a few years earlier and still really was happening in Ireland at the time. The two big magazines which were produced in Harlem around the Renaissance, the Survey and the Crusader, both regularly featured examples from Ireland. In fact, one of the editions was handed over to in 1920 of the Survey was handed over to some of the Irish literary elite to edit. So right up through 1840s, 1920s, and so on, that flow of influence really, not exclusively, but really went from Ireland across. And then we see, I guess, the birth of what's generally taken as the modern civil rights movement, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus, sparking the famous Montgomery bus boycott. Boycott, the term, had been created, established, developed 75 years earlier in Mayo, in the west of Ireland, where people boycotted, they coined the term when they were trying to socially ostracize Captain Boycott, not pay rents to him. He was a land agent, socially ostracize him and withheld their rents from him. There had in fact been a bus boycott in Belfast in the 1920s when Catholics refused for a while to ride the buses. So there was this interchange and this swapping and borrowing of ideas and slogans and so on, right up from the 1840s right up to the mid-1950s. And then the influence, again, overgeneralizing, but the influence then really swept back across the Atlantic from west to east. And the early civil rights protests in the north of Ireland borrowed what was the imagery and the iconography of what had been happening in the US in the previous 10 years or so. So the very early protests, which didn't get an awful lot of coverage in around 1963, borrowed some of the vocabulary and some of the identification with what had been happening in the American civil rights movement. So the early protests, you saw placards, 1963, racial discrimination in Alabama hits Dungannon. And why don't you ship us off to Little Rock, said some of the other placards in Northern Ireland, in reference to the desegregation of the schools in Little Rock in Arkansas. And so the identification by the early civil rights protesters in the north of Ireland was very much framed with an American lens. I mean, there were other examples they could have picked from all sorts of places elsewhere in the world. You might have thought that more appropriate associations for those living in the north of Ireland would have been elsewhere in the British Empire, other countries which were still or just trying to struggle out of being colonies of Britain. But no, the points of reference were back to the US, and I think that was because there already had been a history of the two movements intersecting. By the time that the movement for civil rights developed in the north of Ireland beyond 63, 64, and then really we get the big international attention around 68, and in the couple of years after that, up to, again, there's no agreed end point for the civil rights movement in the north of Ireland, although many people would take it to January of 1972, where the civil rights protesters in Derry were attacked by British soldiers, and 13 of them killed that day at the end of January. And so if we take that as sort of the end point of the mass non-violent resistance in Northern Ireland, then I guess from 63 to 72, yes, most of the influence in terms of the interchange comes from the US over. And so some of it was haphazard, some of it was fairly shallow, and some of it was much more studied. So for instance, the protesters in the north of Ireland just adopted "We Shall Overcome" as their anthem. I mean, there was no one they needed to apply to or ask for permission to. They just decided, look, this seems to be working in terms of getting international attention, in terms of producing an energy internally here that people want to come, and this is the sort of expression that they want to make. And so they started to sing "We Shall Overcome" in conscious imitation of what was happening in the US. One civil rights protester from the time told me, it wasn't really a very thorough understanding of what was happening in the US, but we liked what we saw in terms of their tactics and in terms of the sit-ins. I mean, it was no more complicated than they sat down, so we sat down. The way that people describe themselves often, civil rights protesters in the north of Ireland, again, drawn fairly deliberately from the US experience. They describe themselves as sometimes Ulster's white Negroes, or certainly we are second-class citizens, or we won't accept a place at the back of the bus. I mean, you still hear some of those terms about the back of the bus still, in reference to an association with the US civil rights movement. And I think that's because the US civil rights movement was seen in Ireland and in Britain, and in other places, that those protesters in Dungannon and Belfast and Derry and Newry and Armagh and all the other places, where they wanted to influence people, they wanted to make that association with the Black civil rights movement in the US, because they were seen as successful and legitimate and credible and all those other things. And so the more association that they could make with them, the greater credibility they brought to their own cause. There were similarities too between the civil rights movements in the north of Ireland and in the US, not least in the friction and the internal tensions and even the splits within the movements. I mean, clearly you had in both movements a discussion around the limits of nonviolence and at what point would armed force, the use of weapons, be justified. You had tensions within the movements around the women's movements and the women's places within those movements. You certainly had tensions between young and old, and that they're pretty obvious, really. I mean, you see direct comparisons between the younger faction of the civil rights movement in the US, the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and People's Democracy, largely a student-focused part of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, and then the older, more moderate, I guess, factions in NICRA, Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association in Northern Ireland, and SCLC, Martin Luther King's Southern Leadership, Christian Leadership Conference. So the parallels there are fairly obvious there, but so too is the connection. It's not just one trying to imitate the other or borrowing slogans or vocabulary. I mean, you see real interaction and connection between the two movements, not least, for instance, when Bernadette Devlin, as she was then, goes to the US in '69, and then a couple of years later too, and she visits Angela Davis, the radical Black feminist who's in prison at the time charged with conspiracy to murder. And Bernadette Devlin, when she goes to the US, really confronts much of Irish America with double standards around support for civil rights, in the north of Ireland, but not necessarily for civil rights in the US. I mean, Irish America has an important role to play in this whole history, and I did think that history has been a little unkind to Irish America. Not that there weren't many racists in Irish America, and that reputation was there for a reason. But it's a bit more complicated than that. You know, there were Irish Americans who were also allies of the civil rights movements, both in the US and in the north of Ireland. You know, one of the earliest supporters of, in a real way, supporter of the Black Panther movement and the free breakfast program was an Irish priest in California, Father Eugene Boyle. And you get people popping up all over the history of the civil rights movement in the US who were Irish or Irish American. And so the history there is a little more complicated than just, oh, well, you know, Irish America was racist, it hated busing, full stop. It's true because of, I guess, the history of Irish people in American law enforcement, particularly. Institutions, you know, the stereotypical Irish cop in Chicago or New York or Boston, they were often at the forefront of policing protests, Black civil rights protests. And so you had these notorious figures like, you know, Bull Connor, who was overseeing the police in Montgomery, you know, Irish American. Fitzpatrick was the Irish American guy who was in charge of the FBI, trying to infiltrate and subvert the civil rights movements in the US. And so, you know, some of that is deserved, but it's also a little more complicated than that. There was, though, the incident in 1969 in Philadelphia at the St. Patrick's Day parade, when somebody asked if they could carry a banner in support of civil rights. And Clan na Gael, the Irish American organization which was organizing the St. Patrick's Day parade, had a long discussion, and they decided it would be okay for someone to carry a banner saying that they supported civil rights, as long as they made clear that they supported civil rights in Ireland and did not support them in the US. So the Irish America was and is a complicated place. I think there's been too much generalization about it, and more study and more discussion needs to be made about its place and its continuing place, vis-a-vis, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement too. But to go back to the relationship between the two movements in the 1960s and 70s, There was, as I was mentioning, some great solidarity there too, when in the weeks after Bloody Sunday, in the middle of February 1972, Martin Luther King's organization, which carried on, of course, after his assassination, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they sent a delegation of people to the north of Ireland, to Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association meeting a couple of weeks after Bloody Sunday. But there were differences too between the movements, right? And some of them pretty fundamental. For the most part, civil rights activists in the US wanted to be full citizens. I mean, their complaint was that they were treated as second-class citizens in their own country. And they appealed to, and they had an American Constitution to appeal to, unlike civil rights activists in Ireland, in the north of Ireland. There wasn't a British Constitution that they could appeal to. But for many activists in Belfast and Derry and Dungannon and other places, they didn't really want to become first-class British citizens. I mean, that wasn't the point, right? They wanted to be treated fairly, but they didn't necessarily want to be British. And that was clearly a big difference between their experience. I mean, many of those in the civil rights movement in the north of Ireland were really separatists. I mean, they wanted a break from a clean break from the rest of Britain, the rest of the United Kingdom. Whereas that wasn't really the push. I mean, there was a Back to Africa movement in the 1970s in the US, but really the point of that Martin Luther King was pushing was that we are Americans and we deserve to be recognized as such, with full voting, housing, education, and all the other rights. I've spoken a little bit about the conundrum or the difficulty that the activists faced in both contexts around the use of armed force. And clearly that developed very differently, especially after 1972 in Northern Ireland. And so the similarities and experience begin to diverge a little bit then, where clearly the north of Ireland plunges headlong into the troubles for another 25 years after 1972. I'll finish up more or less here, although that I would emphasize again that the book that I wrote, hang it up for you here in case you never see it, is 25 years old, right? And that means that plenty has happened since, which obviously I couldn't have put in the book, not least President Obama's visit to Ireland and the whole history there of Frederick Douglass really being surfaced in a way that it hadn't been ever before, I think. When I read the book now, honestly, I'm pleased I wrote it, but some of it to me is already pretty dated. At the time, I remember agonizing a bit about what I should call it, right? And it's black and green, and the full title is the fight for civil rights in Northern Ireland and Black America. And at the time, I remember thinking, oh, should I call it Northern Ireland, North of Ireland, Ireland, Black America? Shall I call it capital B Black America, small b Black, African American? Now I think if I were writing the book from scratch, I have much more difficulty with the term civil rights. I think we've just moved on from a context of civil rights into human rights. Now, I know that at the time that was a terminology, although Martin Luther King was using both terms from the 1950s, human rights and civil rights. But I think it's a little bit of a dated term now, civil rights. When I wrote the book, I did address the issue of the role of women in both the movements, and so there's some gendered lens there, but I didn't explore at all some of the other experiences of people within those movements, of people with disabilities or LGBT people. So I'm pleased I wrote the book. I'm happy I wrote the book, but if I wrote it now, it would be a bit different and more updated. I would say too that in the last 25 years, there has been my work has meant that I've interacted, visited human rights activists in several countries around the world, and both of the experiences or the examples of the Black American experience and the experience of activists in Northern Ireland are both often cited and seen as successful examples. So whether it's in India or Bahrain or Hong Kong, I see the iconography of both of those movements. And I'm often asked about the tactics and what worked and what didn't, and the splits within the movements. And there's an identification with current day younger activists, not just with those two movements, also with the anti-apartheid movement too. But I'd say they're the dominant ones that I'm asked about. What happened? How can you have clerics leading a movement, for instance, in the US civil rights context? Where does hunger striking play? How does it work? How do you get the UN's attention? All of these things are fairly standard questions, and what I'm often asked about is how did those two movements address those questions, the infighting, the non-violent, violent dilemma, all the rest of it. The next time I'm talking about any of these issues is in a couple of weeks' time in Derry, and I say that because the 51st anniversary of Bloody Sunday is at the end of this month, and I think that's pretty instructive itself now, how that anniversary is marked, in that the slogan for the events, more or less a week-long events now, is one world, one struggle. And the commemoration of Bloody Sunday is now really very outward-looking and international. I mean, there are activists from various parts of the world presenting there now. And so the Irish example not only has influenced the US experience for a century and a half, almost 2 centuries now, but has and continues to influence other struggles in other places in the world. And I think that's the trajectory that's on now, that there's much more internationalization and transnationalism. Although, as I say, that isn't new. It dates back at least to the 1840s in the context of these two struggles, but it's becoming much more, I guess, partly because of the internet, people copying and mimicking each other's successes and trying to avoid the failures. So I'll leave it there. I've been talking half an hour, more or less now, and that's what Elizabeth told me I should do. So I'll stop now. More than happy to answer any questions.
Great. That was fantastic, Brian. Thank you very much. So I have just a few questions to kick it off, and then we'll be happy to take ones from the audience. Actually, just before I ask mine, you kind of did touch on it. One of the first questions was, did the Irish activists sing American civil rights songs or compose songs inspired by African American? And you kind of mentioned that, but do you want to talk a little bit more about that, sort of the cultural side of things, or even kind of the commercialization of the cultural side of things? How did that help to popularize things?
Yes, they did. And, I think that happened. We shall not be moved, we shall overcome. Now, again, I don't want to overgeneralize too much, oversimplify too much. Those weren't the only two songs that were ever sung, right?
You're right.
And, throw in there plenty nationalist songs too, right? Mm-hmm. So, if you read accounts of the march, which started New Year's Day 1969, sort of from Belfast across the Derry, which was attacked before it got to Derry, the songs that were sung there were all sorts of stuff, rugby songs, Irish nationalist songs, We Shall Overcome, We Shall Not Be Moved, all sorts of things. And in fact, a slogan for the marchers there, because they were imitating an American civil rights march, which had gone from Selma to Montgomery a few years earlier. And again, I think this illustrates the sort of partial understanding, where the slogan for those marchers going from Belfast to Derry were "On to Selma," right? As though they were imitating. In fact, they got it backwards, because the march had started in Selma and had gone to Montgomery. But the sloganeering, you see it both ways. You see in the Black Panther newspaper, around those years, 69, 70, 71, coverage of what was happening in the north of Ireland, and free Huey, free Bernadette, free Angela, very similar sort of sloganeering. And it was just cool. I mean, it was just cool for both sides, especially the young in both sides, I think, to be associated with each other, and legitimizing, certainly from the Irish side of things, to be telling the world, to be telling a section of the British public even, look, we are just like the American civil rights movement. We are, we're non-violent, we're middle class, we're not threatening, those sorts of things. And so, I mean, it was tactical as well as being real. I mean, I think that, the association was genuinely an emotional one, a sincere one, but it was also pretty advantageous too.
And then, as you say, it kind of breaks down in the north, because I suppose the nationalism element, or separatist element, as you called it, kind of complicates that issue. And am I right in saying, there is a class element then to, we'll say, like the armed struggle in the north, that it was not so middle class anymore, as the violence breaks out, like it tends to be in these working class areas. How much is that a factor, do you think?
I'm not sure I would say that really, and yes, it was a complicating factor, if you like. Both the wish to be treated equally with other neighbours, but still didn't want to be part of that country at all. I think mattered, but I mean, civil rights protesters were being on both sides, were being murdered, and I frankly, I think that the oddity or the unusual response really was that the American side of things didn't get more violent. I mean, you talk to people who were there on Bloody Sunday, and British soldiers came and just
fired on citizens.
Within 10 minutes, 27 people, not all of them died, were here, and so a violent response, working middle class and others, I think was fairly predictable. So I'm not sure that I'd see it so much in a class way, because I think there are other ways to divide it clearly, around a religion or ethnicity, and not all of those people who joined paramilitaries were from working class areas.
Yeah. And so is it, Brian, you think because the state's response in Ireland was so, in Northern Ireland, it was so violent, like because innocent people are being killed, civilians, that's what kind of breaks down the civil rights movement from being this pacifist? I mean, it kind of, the IRA erupts after that, and really civil rights takes a backseat, even though the SDLP party continues, of course, and John Hume and stuff. But, it seems like the movement is the right, maybe it's too strong to say hijacked, but, it's taken over by the more paramilitary side of things, because violence is going on both sides.
Well, I mean,
and
be
this
clear.
is very complicated, obviously, but yeah.
Yeah, there were Republicans in the civil rights movement right from the start. Again, we might think there's some not quite cognitive dissonance going on there, but it's not quite as straightforward. So you want equal rights, or you want to be a separate country. Like, what are you trying to do here, right? And others were, other Republicans were just trying to use the civil rights movement, as they openly admit now. But yes, I suppose a different way to answer it would be that if the British government had been smarter and more ready to concede the demands, 68, 69, then I think the troubles could have been avoided. The complicating factor there was the British government not really understanding Northern Ireland, not really being interested in it, just sort of subcontracting it out to the Unionist government. And so I don't think there was anything inevitable inevitable about the Troubles.
Okay.
And they could have been avoided if, you know, the British government had really conceded what it more or less ended up doing, you know, in terms of now there are still many people, and some people still in North Ireland now, who, you know, don't really think that's the point, right? The parity of esteem thing isn't, you know, equal voting rights, equal rights to public services and so on, isn't what the struggle was about. But for many in the civil rights movement in those early days, it really was.
It was, yeah. Well, God, it just sounds like, you know, in the 101 years that the state has existed, the British government's response has really been negligence, kind of. You know, they've never, why you've held on to something that you're not actually ruling, you know, or that you're not engaging with properly, you know, is kind of crazy. Something you said in the middle of your speech or in your presentation too, I was thinking about, you know, who's an ideal kind of spokesperson and what an ideal movement looks like. This vision we have of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a, you know, as a peaceful man, and then you read some of his, you know, elements from letters from a Birmingham jail, or that speech in the end about protesting Vietnam. Do you think that we kind of, particularly here in America, that they tend to hold him up as this ideal pacifist, you know, something that he may not have been actually? Or where's the, you know, the complicating around him?
I recognize what you're saying there, and
Yeah.
you know, I hear it too about you know, ridiculously about Nelson Mandela being, you know, a pacifist, right? And I think what's happened is that again, I'm going to overgeneralize here, but I think that this is largely true, that much of America is okay with, or even happy to really commend an August 1963 version of Martin Luther King. So the I Have a Dream speech, fine, all right with all that, but, you know, conveniently forgetting or refusing to accept how he developed after that really radical anti-poverty program, you know, accusing the US of being violent actor around the world, anti-Vietnam. The King, the Martin Luther King of 67 and 68 is really pretty different from that 1963 speech, and it's that 63 speech sort of frozen in time, I think, for much of America, and that's the acceptable version that you know, much of America can absorb and is happy to absorb. And yet, you know, there was much more that happened after that.
And especially too, I suppose, when, as you said, you know, the problems within both movements, you know, the not seeing eye to eye with the Black Panthers here, you know, the civil rights movement itself fragments. I'm glad you brought up Nelson Mandela, because I was thinking too, in the middle of all of this, we have apartheid, like in South Africa, you know, and so the Queen, you know, kind of very publicly talked about distancing from the apartheid regime, and you know, I think South Africa pulled out of the Commonwealth actually around this time, you know, and so there's a very interesting, like, British element. We can blame the Dutch too, you know, about what they're doing in colonial territories, what they're doing in Ireland, and yet what we're all kind of saying about how terrible it looked on American TVs to have those, you know, the hoses being turned on people at speeches. So it was much more a global movement than I think we've thought about previously, which is interesting now that Jerry is going global too.
Global. And you know, even from the American side too, you know, there was a huge influence of certainly at a sort of an elite leadership level on the movement in the first half of the 20th century from the Caribbean. You know, who had a more similar experience, I guess, with those in Northern Ireland, because, you know, the British government was still like part of the problem. So you see, particularly in New York, I mentioned in the 1910s and the 1920s, you know, and Garvey and these other, Cyril Briggs and these other radical figures, and their experience had come out of the Caribbean. Stokely Carmichael, later on in the 1960s, you know, being born and brought up in Trinidad, right? And so again, this was also part of my hesitation at the time in using the term African American. I'm not quite sure, like, you know, if the Caribbeans really count as American, but anyway. Yeah, and you know, I mean, my temptation clearly when I talk about this stuff, and when I wanted to write the book and was writing the book, was to see as many similarities as possible, because it sort of proved my point, right? And at some point I realized, it's all right to talk about the differences, and that not everything was similar, because there is enough there to show that there was a real relationship. And
that they're influencing each other somehow.
They're influencing each other, and again, not always great. Irish America, much of Irish America is problematic. You get Irish revolutionary icons from the middle of the 19th century. On one hand, you have O'Connell, who is fantastic in terms of abolition of slavery, and then you have John Mitchell, Irish revolutionary figure, who goes and is a proponent, a big supporter of the Confederacy, based in Richmond. And so it's a little more complicated.
But I think it's such an important conversation to have these days, because we things do get boiled down, unfortunately, to binaries and to black or white, and there's a whole scale of things in between, that it can't be one or the other, or not everybody is all bad. I'm interested if you wanted to talk a little bit though too about, it struck me when you were talking about how Ireland looks today at refugees and the direct provisioning issue. Like, it's in the news a lot at home, and so we're hearkening back to these great civil rights movements of our own, and yet, like, there's a little bit of trouble. Have we let in a lot of Ukrainians, but what are we doing for refugees of colour, and how come people are still in direct provision 8 years later? What has that, or how does that complicate our story?
Well, Ireland has told itself, I think, a story which is partly true, but not totally true, that it played no part in the slave trade. I mean, not in the way that Britain or the US did. And the great version of that story, all of these things are true, but it was the first country in the world to officially abolish slavery in 1192. It played no part in the slave trade. Daniel O'Connell was a huge abolitionist. But that's not the full story. I mean, there were plenty slaves bought, not on that mass scale, but bought and traded by Irish people. And racism in Ireland has clearly been a problem. I mean, Ireland is not untouched by that. With certainly with the traveller community, and now with as time's gone on, it's not like immigrants have just started to arrive in Ireland in the last 30 years, but clearly now that issue is much sharper than it used to be in the south and north of Ireland. And you there has also been a discussion around, and a pretty ugly discussion too, that I've seen in Irish America, about a sort of fictitious mythical past where Irish people were also slaves.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
And how come?
Yeah.
So
we got over it. Yeah,
we got over it. We got an Irish American president, like years before Obama, and we stopped. And the experiences just aren't comparable. I mean, slavery has a weird part in Irish historical psyche. I mean, St. Patrick. Written Irish history begins with St. Patrick, right, who was a victim of a slave gang, right, from Ireland, captured him from Wales or the west of England, and brought him, and he spent 6 years as a slave, right, before he escaped. And you get this references to slavery in Irish resistance rebel songs, right, in Bula Vogue, in the Merry Ploughboys, in the Irish national anthem, right. But I think what the Irish meaning of slavery and its association with slavery is really very different from that Black American experience, and it's just cynical and disingenuous to say they're the same thing.
Yeah, because usually they're talking about indentured servitude, actually, which was a whole different category under the law. And so then finally, this is a much more open-ended question, and again, the audience feel free to chime in with your questions on the Q&A feature. Where are we now? I know your other work is in talking with families and the justice post-Brexit and all of that, and protocols. How are the trials going? Do you think there will be justice for these families that are we've had a couple of hearings and a couple of big reports, but I suppose it's going to kind of flounder a bit, is it?
So I'd say that there is a connection between what was happening in the late 60s and early 70s and and these legacy cases, and the end of the civil rights movement, right? So partly, I think the civil rights movement evaporated or was crushed in Northern Ireland because protesters were getting murdered, and then the murderers were not being brought to account, right? So you had Bloody Sunday, and then you had a whitewash inquiry into it, saying that the soldiers acted legitimately, and other people who were killed, really their families saw no realistic way they were ever going to get justice. And so when these peaceful means of using the law are closed to you, then I think fairly predictably some people will go outside the law and start using non-peaceful means. And so part of the work I'm doing now is to try and help amplify what some of the families of victims of people who were killed, and some of the survivors of torture from that time also, and now looking for accountability and justice. And I don't know how much I imagine that most of the people watching this are pretty au fait with what's happening, but the British government is bringing legislation to try to close down prosecutions of British soldiers and others during that time. Until that actually becomes law, and I still holding out some hope that it won't, but it looks like it will. Some of the families have been able to bring cases, civil cases, in a couple of cases, criminal cases, and they're getting, they're getting vindicated basically. Ballymurphy, there's another one, Spring Hill, West Rock. The inquiry is supposed to happen. Was supposed to open the first real hearing the 20th of February. 5 people were killed there, and I think that spooked the British government. They see a scenario where people are beginning to realize how to use the law in an appropriate way to find out what happened in the 70s and 80s, why their loved ones were killed, who killed them, who was responsible. And some of that success in finding out answers and revealing the truth has really scared the British government. And so I think this is why they're bringing legislation to try and stop it all.
And I mean, that's obviously not really good for long-term peace. I suppose it's a pity, Brian, we never had a kind of a truth and reconciliation thing, the way they did in Rwanda, or, shouldn't we maybe just try and get everything from all sides out on the table? Maybe not, no one goes to jail, because I mean, this would affect people on both sides, right? The amnesty after the Good Friday Agreement applied to everyone too, but how do we kind of get past that if the state won't even admit, their own part in it?
I think that the difference really, I know a little bit about the South Africa context. The difference really for me is that in South Africa, society wanted, by and large, that sort of process, right? It didn't want to go through that court system. It didn't want, the guilty people prosecuted necessarily, or for them to go to prison. But the way that this has been handled so poorly politically by the British government over the last couple of years now is that nobody in Northern Ireland really wants this scenario of a sort of pretend truth and reconciliation thing. Any of the parties, Unionist, Republican, Nationalist, Loyal, none of them want this. It's just not satisfying politically. And so I'm increasingly cautiously optimistic that actually they won't be able to force it through. I saw the other day that the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, was in Belfast this week and said that he'd repeal it if Britain, if Labour wins the next election, which again is more than possible. But a truth and reconciliation or a truth telling may help some people. But there's been several attempts at something like that, and they just haven't really worked.
Too little, too late.
The realistic prospect of anybody going to prison now is tiny. I mean,
the soldiers are nearly in their 80s, aren't they?
Soldiers are very old. One of them died during his trial last year. And it depends. I mean, some families I talk to want a conviction. They want the person who killed their family member to the full force of the law. Others just really see a court case as being really the best way to get the truth out, where you can cross-examine witnesses, which you can't really do in a truth and reconciliation thing.
Yeah.
People are under
and as you
oath,
said, it's
they have to tell the
vindication.
truth.
Like, they'll admit this was a woman coming out of mass, or a 17-year-old boy doing nothing. Yeah. What do you think about Brexit and the protocol and all that? Stormont, we still don't have a government. It's just a nightmare, isn't it?
Well, it is a nightmare, and in some ways it goes back to that abdication of responsibility by the British government, and a sort of misunderstanding, or just lack of interest in what happens in Northern Ireland. I mean, the ignorance around Northern Ireland by the British government, by the British public, frankly, is just as chronic now as it was in the late 60s. And Britain, I think you said something similar to this earlier, but Britain has for 101 years now wanted the sort of power without the responsibility. And Northern Ireland just wasn't a factor in the Brexit referendum for most people in Britain. They didn't understand it. They have still a very rudimentary idea of what the difference between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland is. Very few of them could possibly name the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, right? And so the implications of Brexit on that was just either too complicated or just not even thought of. I mean, I don't think it's going to be anything other than very messy. I don't think there's a clear way out of it. I wish I did.
And Brian, it's very difficult, I suppose, to get the truth out of the Great Britain too, or the United Kingdom. Like, are they feeling the effects of Brexit, do you think, more than they're letting on? Like, they're very gung-ho about, we're delighted we're out of it, but is their economy on a kind of a back foot?
Yes. I think there's also the convenient COVID explanation for when things have gone wrong.
The timing was great.
It's all COVID's fault, right? When things are opinion polls now are showing that a substantial number of people, double-digit figures of people who voted for Brexit now regret it. Wow. But I think the whole debate around the issue was so emotional on both sides, actually, that no matter what the evidence, the Remainers will always believe, or many Remainers will always believe it was a mistake. And no matter what the evidence, those who voted for Brexit will, because it's sort of become part of people's identity now, right? I was for Brexit, and that says all sorts of things, other things about me. Or I'm a Remainer, or was a Remainer, and that says all. And so I think it's a very difficult thing for someone to surrender that truth and say, yes, I was wrong. It isn't just being wrong about who's going to win the cup final, or I voted Tory and I shouldn't have. This is really like a fundamentally an issue around identity for many British people.
Yeah. And Europe are not going to make it easy for them to come back in either. There is a bit of a we told you.
Europe can't just shoot them back in, because they need to make an example of what happens to other countries. If other countries on the edge, whether it's Hungary or Poland or whoever it is, if they start to think, perhaps we should leave Europe, then Europe needs to show, look, this is what happens. Britain, shoots herself in the foot, and we don't go and help it.
So no one has typed in, but you're welcome to, or if you do want to raise your hand and I can allow you to speak. It sounds terrible, but we can unmute you is what I mean. I think a lot of our they're raising their hands. Okay, so Jack, you should be able to speak now if you unmute yourself. Sometimes it's easier to not type it.
Just to acknowledge you, but I had no inquiry further than what you've already very effectively enlightened us regarding. Thank you.
Okay, good, not at all. Thank you. And did somebody else have their hand up that I missed? Eileen. Eileen, you can unmute yourself if you like.
Oh no, hi. I just came in very late, so that was a fumble finger on my part.
Oh, okay, no problem. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, Eileen, are you the Eileen Clancy that I see on Twitter sometimes?
Yeah, a little bit too often. Yeah, that's me. Yeah, no.
Glad to, well, I was gonna say glad to see you, but glad to see your hand
Glad
there.
you're on.
Okay.
Right, no,
Exactly.
but very glad that are you back from Ukraine then?
I got back from Ukraine a few days ago. Yeah.
Okay, in one piece. Very good. Okay.
Yeah.
Great
Yeah,
news.
in one
Okay.
piece is right. Yeah.
Thank
We're
you.
going to have a New York Times journalist next week, the 26th. Malachi Brown is going to talk about, they do the digital investigations kind of for the New York Times. So he
Oh,
put
great.
together that story about Bucha
Mhm.
and the civilian killings there. So that will be on next week on the 26th. He's brilliant. Originally from Broadford in County Limerick. So yeah. So guys, if there are no other questions, I hope I'm not leaving anything out, but I think, Brian, you should probably rewrite your book. It'd be brilliant, I think, to add in all the 25 years.
Yeah, there's plenty. I mean, there's not just stuff that happened since. There's just stuff that had happened that I just didn't know about.
Yeah.
And when I wrote the book, the internet was really in its infancy.
Yeah.
And so archive material has now been digitized. The University of Mississippi's got a marvelous collection around civil rights stuff.
Yeah.
And and around the Northern Ireland, the Kane resource too. So anyway, it would in a sense be easier to write now, but there's much more stuff to throw in. So I would welcome if anyone else wants to do it.
Oh, to take that on.
Take
Cleo asks a great question. Don't you think Martin Luther King would be against the US and NATO arming Ukrainian government?
Don't know. Honestly, no idea. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'm not trying to avoid like taking I'm quite happy to talk about that, but what King would think about it, I just don't know. I'm often asked actually a not a similar question at all, but a sort of a hypothetical. I'd also written a biography of Bobby Kennedy, who was killed a few months before the Derry March of 1968 really took off. And people say, what do you think, if Bobby Kennedy had become president, would that have meant the Troubles didn't happen? And I've no idea. I've just no idea. And I've no idea on King how he would have regarded the Russian invasion. Just don't know. I mean, there's a logic there that says that there's a Russian imperialism at work there, invading a neighboring country. I assume wouldn't have been for that, but I don't know. I think it's too much of a stretch, honestly, one way or the other to try and guess at that.
And especially, I suppose, his lens, was he alive today? Maybe the fact that Black rights have come forward a little bit, no one is saying it's perfect, but he might not have had the same. Oh, she said, sorry, I was asking about the US coup in 2014. Still though, yeah.
Hold on, the US
coup in 2014
of Ukraine.
Yeah,
that wasn't a coup. I was there. It wasn't a coup. It was a mass popular uprising.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how political this Ukrainian, has become like that. Yeah. Okay, so. Thanks, Cleo. Gail said she found your perspective on racism in Irish America very enlightening, that it's a difficult conversation for Irish Americans. It is, I think, we haven't always been able to have them properly, sort of, particularly in terms of that busing stuff, and definitely it drives me cracked when people talk about slavery when what they mean is indentured servants, yeah. But as you said, there were Irish Americans, Catholics involved in SNCC and all kinds of other things, so yeah, people are on a range, unfortunately, of good to bad, and it's not just a binary. Yeah. Okay, well, look, this has been fantastic. Tomorrow night we're back on with a woman from Northern Ireland who is going to talk to us about the Irish tradition of Irish dancing, even among the unionist population up there. A lot of people tend to think that it's, a Catholic or a nationalist background, but it isn't. And so that's Angeline King Kelly tomorrow. Cleo said she's just come back from a Martin Luther King Day protest against the US, NATO, and Ukraine. Yeah. there'd be other people who are out protesting against Russia in Ukraine. So it's a difficult one, to call, I think. Yeah. So anyway, Brian, thank you so much. We're going to try and get copies of the book. Not here, she says, yeah. Well, we're going to try and get copies of the book into the store. And Betty says, thank you so much for a fascinating and insightful presentation. Betty's one of our neighbours, or one of our members with family in the north of Ireland. So she tunes in to all of our Northern Irish topics. Yeah. So thanks, guys, everyone. Happy Martin Luther King Day to you all. I hope to see some of you tomorrow night to talk about Irish dancing tradition in Northern Ireland. And Brian, thank you very much. Next Monday night in the museum, we have our film club, which is going to be about the Camino. It's a documentary made a couple of years ago with Irish musician and artists who sail in a currach over to Spain and then walk the Camino. And on the 26th on Zoom, we have Malachy Brown, as I say, from the New York Times, to talk about Ukraine. So that will be interesting. Okay, I'll have to gird my loins for that one. But thanks very much, everyone. Good night. And Brian, thank you. I really appreciate it. We'll be in touch again.
Thank you very much for asking me. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Thanks. Take care. Dennis Gaffney says thank you too.